very much. I just want to say thank you to the organizers and for Waseda University for having me, and also thank you to all of you. I've already learned a lot from what I heard this morning. What I want to do today is give you an overview of the findings about reskilling that we've been developing at Harvard Business School in the context of the Digital Reskilling Lab. Before we do that, however, I would like to also provide a motivation of why I've been so interested in this topic and why I think it's crucial that we get together to discuss this topic. Personally, for me, this started about 2 years ago when I had the opportunity to serve as an advisor to Mario Draghi, who at that point was the Prime Minister in Italy. I studied productivity in my research life, and I quickly realized that, I mean, it's obvious to all of you, that Italy, perhaps like Japan, has a very big problem of sluggish productivity growth. It was evident at that time, and I think it's evident today even more, that if we want to grow as an economy, it's important to understand ways in which technologies can be adopted. Now, the problem is that when we talk about technology adoption, people are, of course, a key ingredient of this transition. And technology and people have a funny relationship in the sense that adopting new technologies and technological waves often create new opportunities and new occupations. But at the same time, new technologies also make skills obsolete and change fundamentally the nature of certain occupations. In 2019, the OECD predicted that about 32% of jobs may be radically transformed by the introduction of new technologies. 32% is a very big number, and this was before generative AI. Since generative AI has become prominent in the public discussions, current estimates of transformation have accelerated even further. According to a report by Goldman Sachs in 2023, 300 million jobs globally are estimated to be affected by the introduction of generative AI. Again, we're talking about massive transformations. It's clear that this transformation will benefit some. Perhaps there are also new generations that will benefit from these new innovations. But it's also clear that there will be adjustment and that not everybody will be able to catch up to these opportunities. So the critical question is, who is going to exploit these opportunities? Now, when it comes to possible ways through which societies can adapt to technological transformations, reskilling is a word that you often hear repeated in policy-making arena as well as in the private sector. And there is something very appealing about reskilling, which is the idea that investments in training that help people move from one occupation to another could be a potential win-win for both organizations and firms as well as people. If you think about it, these are training opportunities that may help somebody who has a job that is obsolete or about to disappear move into transitions that are on the rise. At the same time, these are opportunities that can open up the possibility for firms to quickly get to the productivity frontier without recurring to the external market, just leveraging the talent, the knowledge, and the motivation that is already in within their premises. Now, the World Economic Forum predicts that 1 billion people in the world will need to be reskilled. This number gives me pause. And it's a big number, and it's very ambitious. And fundamentally, as much as I am optimistic about these predictions, I also am a little bit skeptical. And you should know about me that I am an economist, so I'm by nature quite dry, and I also like evidence. And when it comes to reskilling, unfortunately, the evidence is very scant. There is very little knowledge right now about what type of reskilling programs actually work and what is the impact of these programs on people and organizations. This evidence, however, is critical if we want to allocate funds in a productive way. Now, it's with this motivation that, thanks to an innovation that was introduced at HBS, which is the creation of a D-Cube, which is an institute dedicated to the study of digital transition, that I was able to create with my partner in crime. And I don't know how this translates in Japanese, I hope in a good way. But he's an honest man, but he's somebody who is as motivated as me to study these topics. And we created together the Digital Reskilling Lab. The mission of the lab is to generate evidence. So we are not here to tell companies what they should be doing. In a sense, we know that many experiments are already happening in organizations, and we've heard this morning many of these new initiatives. But we want to learn, and we want to understand which of these approaches are working, and help disseminate and diffuse knowledge of practices that seem to be effective. So what we want to do is to inform policy at the firm, at the industry, and at the government level to facilitate the adoption of effective policies. We decided very early on that we had two broad missions within this agenda. One was the creation and if you like, the understanding what was happening in a way that would allow us to learn from the experiences of different companies. Every company is doing something different, and we wanted to collect evidence on the type of initiatives, which sometimes are very ambitious and very costly, that are happening inside organizations. Being academics, we also have, I think, an opportunity to learn from these different experiences and understand different ways and systematize different ways of doing things, comparing and synthesizing what approaches firms are using. You will see that there are recurring patterns in terms of what they're doing, and we can learn from this analysis. We could also go deeper than what perhaps is possible to do in a standard private setting, thanks to the use of data and methods that allow us to use the vast amount of information that sits in organizations to understand what bottlenecks they are encountering and perhaps help them overcome these bottlenecks. There is also a second part to our agenda, which is the implementation gap. And this is something that we are developing as a lab and consists in partnering with organizations to run experiments within their premises. I think the notion, I'm not going to talk about the experiments today because this is work in progress, but it's very important to go from the conception, from the idea that that we can just look at observational data, at correlations. We should try, and I think the ambition should be, to look at causal impact of these training programs. The same way in which we try to learn about the causal impact of a vaccine by having a treatment and a control group, we can do exactly the same in organizations. We can structure the rollout of a program in a way that it allows us to learn what works and what doesn't work. Eventually, this is also important because some programs, while very effective in specific business units, may fail to translate more globally or across different business units. And so as the lab develops, our ambition is also to help organizations evaluate what scales well, what type of programs can be amplified. Today, I will focus my time mostly on the first part of this research agenda, which is the most developed, and it talks about the evidence that we've collected both in pioneering organizations that are what we say at the frontier of reskilling, companies that have experimented quite a bit and have spent considerable amount of resources and are committed to reskilling, as well as we're going to provide you a look at what happens in the real world, if you like, once you move away from the frontier and you look at representative companies. If I have time, I will give you a sense of the deep dives, but I'll probably focus on the first two for the time that we have together. Most of what I'm going to tell you, I'm going to discuss today comes from an article that we recently published on the Harvard Business Review called Reskilling in the Age of AI, which is co-authored with my with my colleague Jorge, as well as colleagues from Boston Consulting Group. This is what we did. We got together about a year ago, and we decided that one way for us to start this research agenda was to go close to the phenomenon and talk to organizations that are, as I said, investing and they're committed, publicly committed towards reskilling. This led us to the identification of 35 companies, of which some are based here in Japan, but they're global. Some are in the US, in India, in Europe, everywhere, because we realized that excellence, or at least commitment to excellence, was present everywhere. These are very large organizations, so they're not representative of the whole economy. They come from different countries, they come from different industries. But what they were doing was interesting, and let me explain why, what we learned from these studies. What we realized is that these companies were doing they were taking a number of different approaches towards reskilling that involved the whole organization. Not just the HR department, but it was really a different approach that started from the very top of the firm. And in fact, it's something that you heard today in many of the presentations that we had, which is the notion that these reskilling programs were not launched in a vacuum. They were launched as part of a strategic objective. This means that there was a clear business objective linked to the programs. Often it had to do with the need to adopt new technologies, but also to the need to relate to the employees in a different way. So this is a fundamental difference. It was not just a program that was launched to tick the box of doing something good for society, although this eventually it is possible, but it was essential to have a clear business objective. This is important because it's through the clear business objective that you can have the commitment of the top of the organization, and that commitment is credible and visible to the rest of the organization. This type of approach cascaded down below the C-suite. And in fact, something that we noticed in these companies is that they were presenting the reskilling programs and they were communicating the reskilling programs not just as an HR initiative. Again, very important, and those of you that come from the private sector know this very well. If something is presented as an initiative that comes just from one function in the company, unfortunately, especially if this function is HR, it's not necessarily well received or implemented on by the rest of the organization. There needs to be a commonality of objectives. And so, for example, in the companies that we spoke with, the need to implement effectively these reskilling programs was something that was shared not just by the CEO or just by the HR function, but it was something that was socialized and made shared also by the most technical functions, and in particular by the chief technological officers or people who were in charge of implementing the digital transition. It was this conjunction of HR plus technology that made a difference. This, again, if you are following me, you will see that I'm taking you on a journey throughout the hierarchy of an organization. We started from the very top, we went to the level below, and now we are in the middle of the organization, thinking about middle managers and people who report to middle managers. As you all know, if you have practice in the private sector, maybe even in universities, you realize that an initiative lives or dies by what middle managers do. If you try to launch an initiative from the very top and there is no buy-in or no shared understanding of the importance of the initiative by middle managers, unfortunately, your initiative is dead from day one. We found, talking with these companies, that middle managers were not always supportive of these reskilling programs. In part, this was due to the fact that training created some very immediate, how should I say, problems to the middle managers. First of all, they would have to accept that their own employees, and often their very best employees, would need to be retrained. And so immediately they would lose these people, sometimes for days and sometimes for weeks. And this is not something that everybody wants to do. Even worse, when you accept retraining or reskilling as a manager, you also have to accept that your best people may go and work somewhere else in the firm. And again, this sort of internal mobility and the accepting the fact that you may lose precisely your best performers is not often accepted by middle managers. So what we found is that the organizations that we spoke with understood this fact very well, and they were very proactive in overcoming this resistance, thinking about incentives and career progressions that were immune to the resistance of the middle managers. Sometimes they brought the middle managers with them. They provided explicit incentive for them if they developed the career of their direct reports. And sometimes, in extreme cases, they went straight to the employees. They sort of overcame the resistance by skipping a hierarchical level. Again, in a sense, they introduced these programs as a change management initiative and not just as training. So it's a conjunction of training, incentives, visibility of the opportunities, HR infrastructure that all came together. This takes me to the last bit of we are now thinking about frontline employees or people that report to middle managers. And again, one of the challenges that we often heard is that companies were designing these beautiful programs. We saw some of them. They were really wonderful. They looked like a Hollywood production, a lovely platform. I don't know if as beautiful as what you do in Sony, but almost there. There was just a problem. Nobody was taking these courses. The take-up rates were very low. And so what these companies had realized is that it was not enough to design a program that looked beautiful in the eyes of the HR department, but it was important to go deep in the head of the people for whom this program was intended for and understand their motivations and incentives from the employee's perspective. They would talk to the employees. They would think about when these people would have time to take the programs. They would think about ways through which they would help them overcome what are often psychological barriers to learning a new thing. I feel this very personally. I am an applied economist, and if you ask me tomorrow to become a macroeconomist, I would be very scared about this transition. It's not something I've been trained for. But still, it's still within the realm of economics. So we found some very interesting approaches to really get deep into the head of the employees and take their perspective rather than just the corporate perspective, which also implies giving employees the autonomy and the freedom to explore different opportunities. The final step that we noticed, and this is something that I noticed also when I was working as a policy advisor in Italy, is that often these companies were not using the investments, were not thinking about these investments in isolation. Sometimes these organizations were even cooperating with their direct competitors to define skill taxonomies that were valid throughout the industry. This is important because it provides an idea of the type of careers and opportunities that are available at a scale that goes beyond the single organization. And so it creates new occupation at a bigger scale. But then the other piece of the ecosystem that was really important was the role of the government and of policymakers who would be supporting these programs, not just in terms of providing subsidies, but also orchestrating the market for the trainers and the reskillers. I'm not quite aware of the situation here in Japan. I know a little bit of what happens in Italy. And in Italy right now, the market for trainers is a jungle. It's very difficult to understand who's doing a good job and who is not doing a good job. So it's important to create some structure in the market for training that allows companies and people to identify which type of trainers are actually effective. I would say, sorry, on this last bit also, I was glad to hear that Waseda University is being a partner of this Reskilling consortium, because in our interviews, it was also the case that there are opportunities for innovative partnerships between companies and academic institutions. Typically, the creation of vocational training is not something that belongs in standard academic institutions, but there are opportunities here to think about specific skill needs that could be served through this partnership. And this is indeed what we saw some of these companies do. So as you can see, this is a picture that gives you a sense of the 5 paradigm shifts, the 5 different things that we saw doing in these pioneering organizations. There are a couple of things to take away from this discussion. The first one is that these initiatives were not just training. They were really organizational interventions that started from the very top of the firm and were gradually cascaded throughout the organization. The second point, which is often the case in a strategic initiative, is that multiple levers were pulled at the same time. It was not just doing one thing, but it was doing many things together that seemed to move the needle. Now, the question is then, how far are these pioneers from the representative sample of firms? This is an important question to ask, especially if you're thinking about policy interventions. We were very intentional in choosing companies that were not representative, that were outliers, but the question that we wanted to ask then is, how far are these companies from the rest of the economy? So we are starting with this mindset to design and implement surveys that allow us to capture the extent to which the practices that we found in these pioneering companies were also adopted by companies in the representative set, in the overall in the economy. We started in the United States just this summer. We launched and implemented a survey of 1,200 C-suite HR leaders. These are chief human research officers, chief learning officers. And we asked them different information about the way in which they were implementing, first of all, whether they were implementing training programs, and second, how they were implementing these training programs. What we found, and I think this is relevant for the discussion we are having today, is that as we would expect, reskilling was already quite widespread in this sample of companies. About 60% of the companies that we surveyed are already implementing some sort of training program. Not at the scale that we discussed in the earlier part of the presentation, but still, there was quite a bit of investment happening in reskilling. Again, as you would expect, these programs were different. They were more expensive, they were more complex than standard training programs. And again, as you would expect, and perhaps reassuringly, these programs are managed differently. For example, it's more likely that a reskilling program includes some sort of incentives for participation, which is to be expected because you're asking more of people when you involve them in reskilling. However, and this is where I think there is urgency to intervene, it's also clear that many of the best practices that we found in our article are yet not implemented. And I want to give you just a snapshot of how far the frontier is from this representative sample. This is a way to map the questions that we had in the survey to an index that give us a measure of the extent to which companies are adopting the practices that we collected in the survey. In this index, it's very simplified, but for every domain, for each of the 5 paradigms that I discussed, a company can have a score of 0, meaning they don't adopt any of these practices, or a score of 3, which means that they adopt all the practices that we survey. What you see from this graph is that the adoption of the different practices is, first of all, not complete, and second, very uneven. And in particular, we are finding that there is a lot of delay in the adoption of practices that involve employees. It's this number 0.5 there at the bottom that tells us that of the many things the company could do to involve their employees in the design of and the implementation of these training programs, they're really not doing much of what's possible. I think this is interesting because it perhaps gives us a sense of where the first actions should be taken. The other piece that I wanted to take away from this is that even companies that excelled in one area, in one of the paradigms that we surveyed, let's take, for example, number 2, which is the one where there is most advancement, making sure that reskilling is a shared responsibility across managers. Those companies were not necessarily excelling in the other paradigms. So if you remember what I told you a moment ago, which is very important for these practices to be adopted as a bundle altogether, this tells you that there is a lot of work to do. And so a summary of this, it's the distribution of these different scores, where you can see that, in fact, there are very few companies that excel in all dimensions. There are a few companies that are very behind, the ones close to 0, and most of the organizations live in the middle. They do some of these practices, but not all of them. So again, this is, I think, food for thought. How do we move companies to be at the frontier in all these dimensions? And that's the organizational challenge that companies are facing today. I also want to highlight one point that I think is very important. And the point is that in most of the organizations that we surveyed, there is somehow an assessment of whether skills are being learned, but there is very little systematic assessment of whether the programs work. And in fact, when we ask organizations whether they had an estimate of the return on investment on these programs, only a tiny fraction of the companies in our sample had estimated a return on investment. I think this is important. Why? Because for 2 reasons. First of all, if we don't have a mapping between training and business objectives, it's going to be hard to build on the momentum and build the commitment that is needed to invest effectively in these programs. And second, if there is no systematic measurement, it's going to be very hard to learn. And I think that at this point in time, what we need is more rigorous evidence that allows companies and policymakers to learn from the experiences and advance and build on these experiences. I have, I think, 1 minute left, if I'm not over time. 1 minute left. So I want to just leave you with one thought and perhaps one idea that I hope will resonate with those of you in the room, which is that policymakers can play a very important role in fostering the evaluation of these programs. I've been personally involved in an initiative that was launched in Italy a year and a half ago, where the government is providing funds for a public-private partnership where 350 million euros will be spent to digitally reskilled people who don't have a job. Now, the critical role of the government here, besides helping with the subsidies, is to establish that every company that uses these funds need to be evaluated. The effectiveness of these training interventions need to be evaluated through a counterfactual method. And so the government is orchestrating and centralizing the evaluation of the training programs. Again, this is something that is lacking, but I think is going to be essential for us to make progress. So I'll conclude with a few thoughts. The first one is, I hope it's clear that reskilling is essential to drive business transformation. In that, I completely agree with the World Economic Forum, with the OECD, and with many policymakers. However, the point that I would like you to take away is that reskilling is also complex. It's messy and it's costly. And therefore, it's essential that first of all, understand what the best practices in reskilling are, and second, make sure that these best practices are disseminated. I think that an important point here, which was clear from the presentation we heard earlier, is that reskilling requires a different strategic and organizational context to succeed. It's not just about providing money to people or to organizations, but it's important to think about how these investments are embedded in the organizational context. And I think it's clear also that reskilling needs more evidence. We need more evidence to understand what works and what doesn't work. For this learning and for this evidence to be generated, we're going to need leadership support at all levels. And we're going to need data, which, however, already exists in many organizations. Data is not the limitation right now, but we need to understand how to use this data to move the needle. And I think that in this case, if you allow me, public-private partnerships and partnerships between academics and private sector are going to make a key difference. Thank you very much.